So this week we got to learn a little bit more about the backgrounds of women and minority judges, as well as the experiences that shape their judicial decision-making. The readings also touched on how the courts have become more diverse than ever in age, localism, and career patterns, especially among women and African American judges. However, I wanted to focus my presentation on a core trait shared by women and minority judges that was mentioned in many, if not all, of the readings. I think that this core trait is one of the essential factors that differentiates female and male judges, minority and white judges. So why is diversity important on the bench? If judges are supposed to be impartial, to not see race, class, or power in the courtroom, why does it matter if a judge is male or female, black or white? A compelling answer to me was empathy. Although we would like to believe that justice is blind, judges are people too. They are shaped by their background and worldviews. Even after a judge puts their robe on, they still, unconsciously or consciously, bring the outside world into the courtroom. Having diversity on the bench is important because if judges cannot empathize with both parties in the courtroom, if they have not experienced and seen the challenges faced by women and minorities, then they cannot rule justly. If judges in America are overwhelmingly white and male, then justice in America will be overwhelmingly white and male. But what exactly is empathy? Well, empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Now, the Moyer and Hare reading pointed out two different kinds of empathy coined by sociologists. Trait empathy is the similarity between the observer and the actor. For example, I'm a twin, so when my twin brother Jake clumsily slips and falls while running, I express trait empathy because I'm his brother and share his trait of clumsiness. Situational empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. For instance, when someone cannot get into a class and tells me about it, I express situational empathy because I imagine how bad it would be to not be able to get into the class of my choosing. In the courtroom, this matters because white male judges can only express situational empathy for women and minorities, while minority and women justices can express trait empathy as well as situational empathy for female and minority parties. These graphs show the drastic difference in worldviews that whites and blacks hold in the U.S. The graph in the top left-hand corner shows that the perceptions of how African Americans are treated varies widely by race. Whites perceive much less discrimination against African Americans than African Americans see. The graph in the right-hand corner shows that the state of race relations in the U.S. varies widely by race. 38% of whites already think that our country has made the changes to create racial equality. However, less than 10% of blacks think that this is true. 43% of blacks, in contrast, think that our country will not make the changes needed to give blacks equal rights with whites. 8 in 10 blacks say they feel at least somewhat connected to a broader black community in the U.S. Now this brings in the concept of linked fate. Linked fate means that what happens to a group as a whole is relevant and affects their own life. Linked fate is the belief that the fate of the group affects the fate of the individual. This statistic shows that many African Americans believe that their fate is tied to the fate of the greater African American community. So how does this have to do with judicial decision-making? Well, African American judges bring their heightened awareness of the discrimination facing African Americans into the courtroom, helping to create just legal outcomes through trait and situational empathy. But how is this empathy created? Well, empathy is essentially created through the background of these minority and women judges. So these facts about African American judges come from Michael David Smith's work, Race versus Robe, The Dilemma of Black Judges. It is important to keep in mind, however, that these statistics come from the early 1980s, so may not reflect the current makeup of African American judges in the United States. Most African American judges come from humble backgrounds. 60% come from working class families and 30% came from middle class families. They moved from a young age from the South to northern cities. Most families left the South to seek a better life for their families. One aspect of this was economics, as many families sought to escape the hardships of sharecropping. Sharecropping often forced families to take on lots of debt to buy seeds and farm equipment for their family. It was also high risk because if the crops failed, they could be forced off their land. Sharecropping was essentially the way that whites kept exploiting labor from African Americans after slavery was outlawed in the South. The opportunity to make a steady, high wage in factories in northern cities enticed many African Americans to pack up their things, leave their farms, and seek better opportunities in the North. The mothers and fathers of black judges were exceptionally well educated compared to the African American community as a whole at the time. Most became politically aware in college or in early childhood, and 22% became active in politics through the civil rights movement. 30% of black judges say that civil rights is a primary source of concern in politics for them. Many became interested in law through racial issues and how litigation could help further the African American cause. African American judges were often civil rights organization leaders, but they were often involved in more moderate litigation-based activist groups such as the NAACP and the Urban League. Race issues often incited their interest in law, as they saw it as a way to promote social justice. African American judges also went to all-black universities such as Howard. Before they became judges, African American judges struggled to practice law full-time. When they did practice law, they were usually practicing as solo practitioners for fellow African Americans in urban cities. In summary, race was a factor in the legal education, socialization, and law practice of these African American judges. These judges' backgrounds, experiencing racial inequality and injustice firsthand, has shaped their judicial attitudes. 95% of African American judges say that there's a long journey ahead before we reach racial equality, and 2/5 of them think that there's class discrimination in the lower courts. They think that sentencing is inequitable both socioeconomically and racially. 97% of African American judges think that the courts are an instrumental tool for achieving black justice and progress. They think that black judges serve a special role in the community because they're able to serve as a role model and rallying point for their respective African American community at the local level. Also, they're able to exert power on the rest of the local legal system. For example, lawyers, police officers, and the prosecutor's office. Black judges are often conflicted on how to wield their dual roles as executors of justice and protectors of the black community. As you can see in this graph on the left-hand side, black judges are conflicted in the manner in which they should wield their power. About half say that they should wield their power in a manner that especially protects blacks, and about half say black judges should not wield their power in a manner that especially protects blacks. In summary, the background of these African American judges shapes their judicial attitude, making them more empathetic and more conscious of the problems that African Americans face. I wanted to share with you 2 anecdotes from 2 influential judges, Judge Leon Higginbottom Jr. and Judge Sonia Sotomayor. I think that these insights into the formative experiences of these minority judges will illuminate how they came to assume their judicial attitudes. Let's start with Judge Higginbotham's story of housing discrimination at Purdue University. There were only a dozen black students when I entered Purdue, which at the time had about 6,000 white students. All of the black students live in a separate house. We slept in the attic, which had no heat. After 2 winter months of going to bed every night wearing earmuffs, 4 pairs of socks, and sometimes a jacket, I decided to go talk with the university's president. I felt we should at least have heat, and I asked President Eliot if we could have a segregated section, of any dormitory on campus that had heat. Eliot looked me in the eye and told me the law didn't require the university to allow colored students in a dormitory. He told me either to accept things as they were or leave immediately. As I walked back from the president's office, 1,000 thoughts were going through my mind. Why would the law not permit a dozen good black kids to sleep in a warm dormitory? The law had been very effective in the draft for the war going on at the time. Some of my very best friends had been drafted, went to war, and died for our country. At that moment, Eliot was telling me about the law. Thousands of black soldiers were overseas, fighting, putting their lives on the line to make the world safe for democracy. Yet here at home, the legal system that proclaimed equal justice for all wouldn't allow a dozen black boys who hadn't done anything wrong to sleep in a warm dormitory. I realized after talking with Eliot that I couldn't go into engineering. I realized that I had to try to challenge the system. That experience with Eliot convinced me that victims of oppression have to be willing to fight their own battles. You have to take the burden of challenging the unfairness and injustice in the system, or the system is not going to change. Wow, that story from Judge Higginbotham clearly shows how his background has shaped his views on justice. You can see clearly now why he's a judicial activist. Now let's read the next excerpt about Justice Sotomayor's childhood from the New York Times article we read for today. She was a child with dreams, as she once said, the little girl who learned at 8 that she had diabetes, who lost her father when she was 9, who devoured Nancy Drew books and spent Saturday nights playing bingo, marking the cards with chickpeas in the squat, red brick housing projects of the East Bronx. So you can see from this passage that Justice Sotomayor faced both socioeconomic and racial adversity in her youth and throughout her entire life, and it helped shape her judicial attitude. Now let's compare the experiences of Judge Higginbotham and Justice Sotomayor with the experiences of late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. This is from an interview with The New Yorker in 2013. Justice Scalia is the little boy circled in the picture to the right. Every cloud has a silver lining, and one of the benefits of the exclusion of women from most professions was that we had wonderful teachers, especially the women who today probably would be CEOs. My first crush was a girl in this class whose name was Theresa. She's the one standing to the right of Miss Sconis. She's good-looking. I always had good taste. Hugh McGee was generally the class troublemaker, in the middle seat on the right, 2 girls behind him and 2 boys in front of him. He was a really smart student, but he was always getting into trouble. The school was a very mixed group of people. There are no blacks in the class, and there really weren't any in our neighborhood. But other than that, it was, my goodness, polyglot. There were Greeks. One of the girls in the class was named Eurydice. We didn't even know how to say it. We just called her Eurydice. There were Irish, German, Jewish, Italian. It was the face of New York City. As you can see from this anecdote, Justice Scalia had a pretty privileged childhood. He went to a racially segregated school that had very good teachers. Justice Scalia did not have to deal with the same kind of adversity created by class and race, as both Judge Higginbotham and Justice Sotomayor had to overcome. So now that we've seen the importance of personal experience in judicial attitudes, is belonging to the same group enough for judicial empathy, or does personal experience matter? What do you think? Based on today's readings, I concluded that yes, belonging to the same group is enough for judicial empathy, but personal experience stimulates further empathy. Let's look at the data. A study done in 2000 by Martin Pyle concluded that gender is more important than party affiliation in determining judicial ruling on divorce and family law cases. Also, a study of Clinton first-term appointees showed that female and black judges are more supportive of minority claims than white male judges. Another 1997 study showed that contested custody cases that had all male panels were generally pro-male, but mixed-gender panels of judges showed no favoritism. However, the Trailblazer study done by Moyer and Hare showed that female judges' formative experiences with discrimination are the only judges to show attitudinal feminism in their judicial decision-making. While it is unclear what broader implications can be drawn from this study, it certainly emphasizes the role of personal experience with discrimination in shaping minority and women justices' judicial attitudes.